not all of it is a quote, but I think this is, we can look at this more closely. And it's really about the notion that this is a regional custom. So first we ask, well, why are they doing it in general? But then another specification is that it seems to be a custom across the Massif Central in this area of France. And Bernard even realizes that. He says, I'm from the north, and we don't do this up there. And in fact, she's an idol. She's just not the appropriate image. He says that in particular in terms of another one. But let's look at some of these quotes. He wrote, according to immemorial usage and ancient custom in Auvergne and the districts of Rouergue and Toulouse, as well as the surrounding areas, each one raises a statue to his patron in gold or silver or some other metal according to his means. There the head of the saint or some other limb is reverently enshrined. The enlightened meaning no harm, considering it to be superstition, a surviving practice from an earlier devil or rather demon worship. So at first he's really quite horrified by these images with their heads and their faces. But when he finally gets to the statue of Saint Gerard of Aurillac, which is one of the most famous of these maestas. Unfortunately, it doesn't survive any longer, but it was an image of a nobleman who became a monk, Gerard of Aurillac. He's a very important saint for this period and the region because he becomes a leader in terms of this notion of the nobility following Christ. And so he had a particularly important maesta. He exclaims, what do you think, brother, of this idol? So he right out calls it an idol. You know, he has no problem with that. And someone today said to me, it's an idol. That's what it is. You go in that, you said that, in the treasury. It's certainly an idol. And would Jove or Mars have considered such a statue unworthy of him? And he exchanges some ironical remarks at the expense of the image. He continues commenting, for where worship is rightly due only to the true supreme Godhead, it is evidently both wrong and absurd to make statues of stone, wood, or copper, excepting the crucifix of our Lord. For it is customary everywhere in the Holy Church to have his image either carved or molded in order that we be moved to commemorate our Lord's passion. But when it comes to a visible record of the saints, the true testimony of a book, or their shadowy figures painted upon the wall, we are all that ought to be shown. For images of the saints should be under no circumstances be permitted except in the case of abuse of ancient date and deep-rooted in unalterable custom. So what does he think is okay and what is not okay? Bernard, here in this early passage from the Liber Miraculorum, what's acceptable in terms of imagery? What? Narratives. Shadowy images on the wall. Anything else? The crucifix, right. And he says that is going to be reminiscent of the Passion. So one wonders whether he's referring only to the cross itself or a figure, a corpus of Christ hanging on the cross. It could be either way. It's not very clear from what he says. And this always happens, of course, in medieval texts. We're not sure what they're exactly saying. But it might be either one, and we certainly have records of Carolingian crucifixes with the corpus on them. So, so he could be talking about either one and finding that acceptable. And certainly even in the Libri Carolini, the Caroline books, the crucifix is the thing that is accepted and okay, as well as the narratives of saints, so paintings on a wall. So what is the real thing that's bothering Bernard? What's the problem with this figure? It's a statue, so it is fully round. That's really, you know, three-dimensional sculpture is the issue that he's having problems with. Yeah.
The question about the corpora of the crucifix is
yeah.
Because we don't have any surviving, so we are
no.
speaking about texts.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the corpora were really three-dimensional or not?
Say it again?
That the corpora give it third dimension.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that. I know there are a lot of people who challenge the texts that are discussed and say they're later or we're not sure and so forth and so on.
I would imagine something more close to the crucifix of Francisco d'Assisi, something like this. So
flat.
Corpora, which is like just design text.
Mm-hmm. painted.
What is it like? It's painted on the air, but you have this.
Well, we have reliquary crosses with figures on them. So
That's right.
um,
So you really believe in a big crucifix?
I didn't say big. It doesn't have to be big. I'm not sure. I mean, we can't know.
No, of course.
Yeah. There's a text about Saint Maur that discusses. It sounds as if that is a figure, and it's substantial. And certainly by the time you get to the Garo crucifix, that's, and the Ottonian examples. So that's not that much later, and certainly contemporary with most of what we think of with foi. Depends on when you date the foi, and I'm not going to claim to be a specialist in terms of dating the first Majestat of foi. It's a problem, and it's discussed by a number of different people in terms of when it dates and what it looked like at the beginning. So we'll get to it, though. But at any rate, so Bernard's problem here is that it's sculpture. It's that it's sculpture at all, a three-dimensional, something that looks very much like an idol. And we can't blame him. It does look like an idol. What do the other statues of this area look like? These other Majestat, these other common images from the south to Bernard. He's like a proud northerner. What is this? What are they up to here in the south? Well, here are a few of them. And what would you say is common to these figures as you look at them? What's that?
The gesture.
Yeah, the gesture. Yeah. Wide eyes, good, yeah. And they all have, of course, mouths as well. One might expect that from a face. But I think it's very important to imagine it because if this sculpture, if you want to break it down semiotically in a way, it's hands that respond to your prayer, it's eyes that can look at you, and it's a mouth that can answer you, so that it becomes these certain essential elements that some of these are so primitively done. Some head reliquaries are so primitively done that really you can break it down to that's what they have, and that's what they need to have. They are not fine artworks in any sense. These are very animated, at least. The hands are changed, en chafra, but Caesarius seems to be relatively original. Both of these are constructed in the same way as foi, in the sense that they are wooden cores covered with precious metal sheathing. Now, most often that is silver. So that's actually, or gilded silver. So that's actually one of the things that stands out about foi, is she is actually gold, mostly gold. So she's, in a sense, and somewhat a little more precious than others. Here's a very impressive character, Baudim, and he is gilded. He is not made of solid gold. So again, we get that same. Actually, Dahl claims his eyes moved. I've never seen anybody else say that, so I don't know what he's talking about. And I've seen him on exhibit a couple of times. And yes.
I was thinking that it should be. We have to verify it Friday. I would love to verify it Friday, but my impression is that the eyes can move with the hands.
Oh yes, surely.
So if you get a candle which is moving, since there is blue glass, maybe you will get the impression that it's moving with you. Approach it, let the visceras dance with the object.
Oh yeah.
In this sense, maybe the eyes were moving with the candles.
Well, there's a tradition of animated figures in the later Middle Ages, where figures were almost treated like puppets. They had jointed arms and legs. They could be moved. There's the Brno cross that was manipulated by priests behind the scenes. And that's made a great deal of fun of by later reformers. And Dahl seems to suggest that these eyes were movable, but I don't know how that would work at all. Movable, yeah. No, so I don't know where he got that idea, and maybe it was just a text that seemed to say they moved. At any rate, so these images that I've just shown you a group of, and there were many of these. Most, I would say the majority, have disappeared, but we have these three that are good representatives of the type. Were so important within the church structure in the South that, in fact, they were thought to, in some sense, embody the saint. So again, we get back to that issue of, is it foi or is it a reliquary? are they separable? But I think that very much within the psychology of this cult, her reliquary was her. They took it to be her and her presence because, of course, the relics were inside of it. And one of the ways that these were used, it's so fascinating, in a movement called the Peace of the Church, which was an ecclesiastical movement that tried to address the violence of the nobility that I talked about yesterday, to try and get the lesson across to the nobles that they needed to curb their violence, to act with reverence towards the church, and to not mess with ecclesiastical lands and properties, not try and take them over, that they would use these saints very actively. So there was one famous council where all of these figures were brought together in a field under a tent and made to be arrayed, one presumes, in a kind of a semicircle, and they held court and exerted their power. Now, whether these strategies had any lasting effect, they did seem to make quite an impression. Because, as I say, these images were thought to somehow represent the power and force and personality of the figures. So these majesties participate in a complex representational system that calls upon the viewer to engage fully in a spiritual understanding of the liturgy, of eschatology, the end of time, and of the salvational nature of intercession, which we talked about last time. That system supports a liveliness or animation of the figures and the heads, which is not a function of magic or superstition, but as Bernard himself finally admits, after dramatically saying, Gerard is an idol, he then comes to realize that this is not what's going on. He says, nor did any doubt linger as to whether the image was a foul idol. The image represents the pious memory of the Holy Virgin, before which, quite properly and with abundant remorse, the faithful implore her intercession for their sins. So we have this transformation occurring in Bernard's text itself. It goes from a kind of a staging of the notion that these are idols, but he does it with somebody else, Gerard. He's writing about Foix. So he goes ahead and this is a very manipulated text, in other words, what I'm saying. Are we to believe that Bernard really is accusing Foix of being an idol? I don't think so. He's made up his mind before he starts writing. And he is just dramatically putting it forward as a possibility that she is an idol. And he stages that with his interaction with Gerald of Aurillac. And now when he gets to Foix and confronts her statue, then he says, no, there is no doubt. And she is there to be a person of intercession. So that you go through perhaps that same progress and understand that she is a holy figure. What's that?
I just would like to ask, what you think was the motivation for such a text he wrote? If it was some, a discussion about the idols in that period, and then he just, put this text into this discussion, like in the contribution to defend those kind of statues, or?
Well, I think that it's, yes. I mean, most people have understood Bernard. I mean, some people discuss Bernard as if he's being very, very straightforward in this text and revealing that he himself thought these things. But I really don't think so. I think it's, as I say, a manipulated text in which he makes it more dramatic, that Foix asserts herself as a holy figure. But he's certainly dealing with the notion that where he comes from, the north, these figures don't exist. So it's his perception of why they work and why they are legitimate figures in the church. He's very aware of the Caroline texts and the other traditions in the north that, as we say, frescoes are okay, paintings are okay of narratives, the crucifix is the only thing. But then this is an extraordinary presence, and how are we to understand it? So he takes us through a sort of set of steps of coming to understanding it. And I like the way he uses another figure before he comes to Foix herself, yeah?
So maybe the text was aimed to
Yes.
this were existing.
Yes, he probably sent this, a copy of this back north, or parts of it, to be, to his school, to his professor. What do you think of this? So that seems pretty likely. Yeah. Did you see the copy of the Liber Miraculorum in the treasury? They have the copy, the medieval manuscript in the treasury. So you have to notice it next time you go.
We have the facsimile at the Conques.
Oh, you do? Okay.
When we receive the notes, they must just get it. So we have the facsimile, we maybe we touch it. Facsimile are touchable.
Yeah, right. So we talked about how she's a majesty, and again, that's a word that Bernard actually uses. So that's another justification for her presence, that she has a majesty, that implying a power. I'm not sure that word means queenship or kingship. I think more the power, or because Christ majestas is not really about Christ as king as it is Christ as the power of having this tremendous power.
Maybe just because of this small thing of Eric Palazzo, who insists a lot about the fact that the medieval term majesty is really about the attitude of the object, and not like a category which becomes later in art history. So when we are speaking about majesty, we are thinking of a certain kind of, let's say, iconographic image, and Eric is trying to demonstrate the opposite, that this categorization is absolutely outside of medieval texts. So if you use the word majesty, it's just to say that there is a certain, I don't know how to say, power.
Yeah, power.
Out from the image. So that's interesting. So because we are tempted thinking of majesty, just and I don't know what. No, we are really thinking about power which is coming out from the image. We are in front of the presence which is powerful, and therefore it has to be called majesty.
Yes, I think that's a good summary. So, and again, Bernard addresses this further. And in fact, he makes a comment and compares her to the Ark of the Covenant. So, or the statue is to be understood most intelligently in this way. It is a repository of holy relics. So to Bernard, I mean, that was a quote. It is a repository of holy relics. So it's very important to him that this statue has as its core relics. This is a distinction that is quite interesting. Now, I don't know how many, I should have put one in, I suppose, to show you, but you know the type of statue called a throne of wisdom, a wooden statue of the Madonna, also common across this area of France, but elsewhere as well. And there's a famous study on that by Eileen Forsyth, the Throne of Wisdom. And in that, she investigated a whole series of these statues. And the question was, is that the criteria that allows them to make the statue? Her conclusion was no, because not all images of the Madonna had relics in them. Let it set aside whether they're relics of Madonna, but any relics at all that would somehow make the image legitimate. So, but many medievalists have gotten very concerned about this very comment then. Is it the relics that legitimate three-dimensional sculpture? Bernard seems to be saying it is, but let's hold that aside as we think about this further. At any rate, so it's a repository of holy relics fashioned into a specific form, oh, and I love this phrase, only because the artist wished it. So we get sort of the whim of the artist introduced here in this medieval text. This seems very unusual in a medieval text. The whim of an artist, only because the artist wished it. But maybe calling it a whim would be too modern. And maybe we should just say that he's saying that is an artistic accomplishment. He's recognizing this as a piece of art, as an artificial creation that has a certain quality to it, just like Berthold of Weingarten put the relics into a head to excite people. Again, in a way there the patron is acting like as, because the patron wished it, because the artist wished, whatever. It becomes a decision, at least, clearly in this moment. It has long been distinguished by a more precious treasure than the Ark of the Covenant once held, since it encloses the completely intact head of a great martyr, who is without doubt one of the outstanding pearls of the heavenly Jerusalem. So he's cramming a lot into that sentence too, yeah? There's quite a lot going on there. He compares it to the Ark of the Covenant. I said yesterday, in a kind of a throwaway line, but certainly one I very much believe, the Ark of the Covenant is the Ur reliquary. It is the thing that becomes the model for all reliquaries. It has precious items in it. It has the manna in it. It has the rod of Aaron in it, etc. So it has, in some sense, relics in it. And it is held in the most precious part of the church, or the temple, excuse me. I said church, meant temple. So that that Old Testament text justifies the making of reliquaries in some sense. And we find it often in texts about reliquaries. In fact, the most common word for a reliquary in the Middle Ages, and it has nothing to do with the shape, I don't think, is arca. So, so he makes a comparison to the Ark of the Covenant, but he says it's even better. Foi is better than the Ark of the Covenant because we have the completely intact, interesting, completely intact head of a great martyr. Now, not the complete body. People get fixated on whole bodies, but at least we have a completely intact skull, apparently, who is without doubt, and here he gets in, that connection that I was emphasizing yesterday as well, to heaven, to the heavenly Jerusalem. She's one of the pearls of the heavenly Jerusalem. So we're not at all fixed on this image in front of us. We've moved in time back to a precedent in the Old Testament, and we've moved heavenly in terms of the heavenly Jerusalem. So she becomes a kind of a nexus for that material. And it's as if the skull inside is the battery that gets it going, you know, that animates the whole piece. For him, it's essential that that be in there for the whole thing to work. But maybe he shouldn't have been so easily comforted. I mean, she is an idol. Come on. Yeah.
Because of the Libre Caroline, of course.
Yeah.
Rufus is insisting on the fact that the Ark of Covenant is the only object created by God. So it's the reason why it's legitimate to do it as an image. And it's the reason of the faith and all those stuff. So it was interesting to imagine that this kind of logic is really a step after. We justify the images into the Libre Caroline with the presence of the Ark. So that's automatically present into the reader. So it's an arca, so the image is already legitimated by the arca, but it's even better.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
not, I mean, of literal reminiscence, because Dahl was thinking or supposing that Bernard is quoting the Caroline. So that
Well,
would be a sort of
Dahl assumes that, but I mean, how many copies of the Libre? You can see that she's encrusted with gems, and she is made up of many pieces of metal, not a single surface of any kind, that she is a kind of a composite. But probably one of the most fascinating things about her is that her core, the real essence, the thing that began this sculptural project, is a Roman portrait head in gold. That when the statue was restored, they took it completely apart, and there you see the head by itself in photographs from the 40s. And you can see that it does look like a man. There's no question that that is a male head once you get it outside. We believe it, we see it as a woman, en foi. It's not a problem. I never saw it as male until you see that picture, and then you think, yeah, that's a man. And you can see that it's a very high status male, possibly even an emperor, because it has a kind of a diadem there in the hair, which becomes part of her reality as well, although it's a little obscure by the crown. So beginning with a Roman repoussé golden portrait bust, perhaps of an emperor, perhaps of the 4th or 5th century. It's very difficult to date gold, and you have to go completely by style. This could range in dates, but the best guess is 4th or 5th century. So only through elaborate adjustments, additions, and gifts does it become from a pagan male to a Christian female. She lacks, however, through this very nature of composition, she lacks a date. You know, this is a very troubling thing for art historians, especially traditional art historians. How do you date foi? Well, you don't, because she's 4th or 5th century, no, she's 9th century, no, she's 10th century, no, she's 11th, no, she's 14th, no, she's 15th. She really is a range. It's very, I mean, I remember when I first was teaching as a young professor, we had to use slides and find them in big catalog, boxes in the slide library, and literally she was filed in 5 different places. I had to keep finding her here and there, and oh, here's another detail. It was very, very amusing because it's just bothered people. In fact, I would argue, and this is something of an aside, but that this is one of the reasons that reliquaries were long avoided by art historians. Why art history never really grappled with the question of reliquaries? Because they become very difficult to date. Patrons and users, audiences are perfectly comfortable with these objects. In fact, they want them to be brought up to date. Keep this figure current, make her very much part of our community. Not some old and antique thing that's frozen in time, as she is now, but bring her up to date, give her a new pair of earrings. That would be a good thing. So that's a problem of her as well as all reliquaries, I would argue. Bernard says of the statue, the most outstanding of the ornaments then was the splendid image, which was made long ago. Today it would be considered one of the poorer ornaments if it had not been reshaped anew and renovated into a better figure. So he's very aware of renovation, and he speaks about it positively. And he speaks about it in the way that I mentioned yesterday. If the shrine doesn't have enough gold, if it doesn't have enough ornament, then it is a poor shrine. It doesn't reflect the glory of the saint. And that's very much what Bernard is saying here. I don't think he's, being an art historian, antique and renovation and trying to date her. No, he's not doing that. He's talking about that glorification, the proper glorification of the saint here in her shrine. And Bernard makes it quite clear that in the renewal of the saint, it's almost like she is sponsoring that. Foix herself encourages the changes because what does she do? She demands jewelry. She demands more gems. She demands more pieces of gold. And most of that, or a great deal of it, comes back to her. So it's as if she's primping or something, or beautifying herself, worried about, as Bernard says, with a simple entreaty or with bold threats, she wrested away valuable things from her devotees. So she's always pulling in these gifts of gold. So let's talk about her materials. I think that's a very important aspect of her materiality. Yesterday we talked about the materiality of wax and tried to consider all of its different aspects because I think it's a very clear point that in the Middle Ages, audiences did look to materials. They didn't only look to the way they were manipulated or used to make artworks, but they actually appreciated the material itself, and that was a very persuasive element of objects. It was a presence and a meaningful presence of the object itself, their materiality. So, what's she made of? The classic, gold and gems, gold and gems. This is the trope in reliquary descriptions. The reliquary was gold and gems. Gold and gems. Literally, that phrase occurs over and over again in reliquary descriptions. It's often inaccurate because it's often gilded silver and glass or something to that effect. But the shorthand version is always gold and gems, gold and gems. Well, she's actually really gold and gems, so good for her. She's not so much gilded silver, although I suspect there's some gilded silver on her. I don't know. I haven't heard the entire breakdown, but she's massive gold for the most part. Of course, with a wooden core. Here's another quote from Dahl. The picture of the New Jerusalem depends primarily on the text of Revelation, where it is described in terrestrial terms as a real city, although built of the most precious materials, gold, gems, and crystal. The materials, in fact, which go into the making of the sacred images, the reliquaries and other church vessels, the heavenly Jerusalem is illuminated by the glory of God, its walls, and he's quoting liberally from the book of Revelation. It's the glory of God, its walls are of jasper, and the city is pure gold, like unto clear glass. That's one of those strange descriptions of gold in the Bible. Gold like under clear glass. When is gold like glass? only maybe in its reflectivity, but it seems very strange. And then there are other places where it seems as gold as white. But anyway, the foundations of the wall of the city are garnished with all manners of precious stones: jasper, sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, sardonyx, sardius, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprasus, jacinth, and amethyst. The 12 gates are 12 pearls. Can we find all of those gems on Foix? I think there's a good bet that we're going to find something like every one of those gems. And so she, in some sense, personifies the heavenly Jerusalem. She's not just resident in it, but she takes on its nature through her materials. And if we go back to the quote of Bernard, he did mention the heavenly Jerusalem. That was right in the discussion. He managed to append those ideas right in a row, the heavenly Jerusalem. So that she doesn't just take us there or take our prayers there, but she, in some sense, embodies it. But, I'd also wanted to bring in some quotes from an article by Herbert Kessler on silver, because although we're not talking about silver on Foix, in so many cases we are, and in some of the other reliquaries we are. So as we discuss materials, I think we should think about that as well. He mentions an inscription on a Maius Est Domini, figure of Christ, on a late 10th century antipendium, altar frontal, in Xanten. And there he quotes a phrase that actually gets reused a number of times. The material and this image show things doubly. The image renders the form of man, the gold signifies his divinity. It's just that kind of crux, that kind of issue. What is the representation here? What does this figure or this art object represent? Does it represent the form, the portrait, the person? Yes, apparently, but doubly, also the gold, the material, actually tells us that this is not divine. Foix is not divine, but she is representative, as we say, of the heavenly Jerusalem, her presence there, her presence in the court of the court of the saints. So that it's almost as if this inscription implies we should think in a double way when we see an image like this, and very much have the material mean to us. Let that material signify to us, in addition to whatever the representation might be that's in front of us. So he goes on and talks about, in Scripture, silver was paired with gold. The two metals equated with divine radiance. Once again, the meaning of the materials is divine radiance. In the Goddess Gulk Evangelary, which is a Carolingian manuscript, there is, in the preface, I believe it is, see the divine precepts decorated with color of roses demonstrate that the gifts of the martyrs should be accepted. The pages were dyed purple there, and that's what he means by the color of roses. Demonstrate that the gifts of the martyrs, which the gift of the martyr, what's the gift of the martyr? Blood. Yes, so that purple or red is should be accepted. The pure virginity of the heavenly dwellings are produced through the glow of costly yellow gold and through the glittering silver. So the doctrine of God, written in precious metals, leads those following the light of the Gospels with a pure heart into the shining halls of the kingdom, flowing with light, and sets those who climb above the high stars of heaven's vaults in the bridal chamber of the King of heaven forever. Wow. But that is speaking very clearly about text, and text written in gold and silver, and how those elements should actually lead us, again, to heaven. But it's very much a matter of the materials and the colors of the material manuscript itself. And Kessler suggests elsewhere in this article that silver functions in this way always, that the presence of silver is a divine radiance, giving a real kind of a sense of the divine radiance to an art object above and apart what the representational qualities are. Many medievalists, including myself, are making this argument today that materiality has a special quality in the Middle Ages. It's rejected in the Renaissance. you know. Alberti wants you to start painting in yellow and not use real gold, because representation is better than the actual material of gold that artists used to put on their paintings, right? You know, the illusion of gold and reflection is better than the actual gold. Well, no, not for the Middle Ages. The actual gold mattered very much. It should be made of gold because that was proper, and that was going to give us the sense of the object. What about the other materials that we have going on in this statue? Not this one, but Foix herself. What about the disgusting ones? That is, the relics. I hope I don't sound too irreverent saying the relics are disgusting, because in fact that's a common modern perception of bones of the dead. But even in the Middle Ages, Theophrid of Echternach, right around the turn of the 11th century, said the relics were disgusting. He puts that right out there. And he says, so we must encapsulate them in gold and silver in order to show them in their true light, in order to present them as they should be presented, even though, then he turns another one on us, and he says, even though the gold is as good as shit. And he actually says that. So material objects from this world are not at all worthy. The relics are the real value, but nonetheless, that's the system within which we work, and we must enclose these disgusting relics in beautiful gold in order for us to see their worth, even though the worth of the gold is not a true worth. So we get a very complex system of materiality, but it's extremely important. Yes? Right.
And the rhetoric of the altar seems to say something quite even more different, I would say. Because the idea would probably be like, we are not dying to see them. They are too high level for us. So we can see only the gold and the stones, which are okay, but it's nothing in comparison to what's inside.
And where is that written?
On the altar, on the golden altar.
Oh, no, okay, yeah. Uh-huh.
It's written in Vignello.
No, yeah. No, but when you said we can't see them,
Yeah, we cannot see them. We can see them.
that's written there too? No.
No.
You're saying that. Okay, yeah, okay. I was going, where's that written? I want to know that one. That's a very exciting inscription. Yeah, right. This is actually total topos within reliquaries. Way back to the first, the relics of Polycarp. Mm-hmm. We have these dust and ashes that are more precious than gold and gems. So that's the topos, and but it's very much of a reality that's expressed over and over again in the materiality of reliquaries. So, and especially in Foix. Now this is a different one. This is one of the reliquaries from Ogun, and I'm showing you him here because here in a very nice little head reliquary, which is probably meant to be on the altar, and you see it even has a little arch. I think it may have been used to shelter the Eucharistic elements underneath it. It very much expresses exactly what a head reliquary or a reliquary of a martyr should express, and that is that it represents the martyrdom of the saints. So the reality is the death of the saint. So we have a little picture there, a narrative picture, that conveys that. That's relatively unusual in reliquaries to get that kind of very direct explanation of what we're seeing here. This is the resurrected or the saintly head of this martyr who deserves to be in heaven. And he is crowned as well. I just wanted to point that out because it is actually 100% typical for head reliquaries to be crowned. This one's slightly more unusual. This is Alexander from Stavelot. And the last one, I'm sorry, was Candidus from Ogun. And here also, we get another something of an explanation on the box on which the head stands. We get Alexander again depicted in enamel in the center, and on either side his companions in martyrdom. So once again, a group of martyrs, and then the head itself sort of rising above it in in gold and silver. This is actually gilded silver. What I wanted to make a point of with these two head reliquaries, which you don't necessarily see very vividly at Foix, because she's sort of a complete capsule of a body, but in this kind of juxtaposition of the head and other elements, we start to see a relationship of the relic to the church. And I think that that doesn't come out clearly with Foix because she has such an independence, but I think it's an aspect of almost all relics if you look carefully enough, and we will see it with Foix as well. Here we see Alexander juxtaposed with other saints. Indeed, the inscription on this reliquary makes it clear that there are many relics inside of this little box, not just the relics of Alexander, who was an early pope. So that in his sacrifice, well, he wasn't martyred, but in his sacrifice, he becomes a member of a larger group of saints, a sort of ecclesiastical structure, and that's brought out by the imagery of the reliquary. When the relic, well, maybe I should go back to show you. Where did he go? Caesarius, the one in, oops, sorry, no, the one in black and white. When that reliquary capsule was investigated in 1951, it contained not only parts of the saint's skull, but a wooden cross. So inside of this container of the reliquary, they not only might put relics of other saints, but they might also put other sacred or associative sacred objects. So oftentimes we imagine a reliquary to be just purely the container for, often we imagine the whole body, but that's really not the case. It's very selective, and then it might be combined with other things. The bust of Theophredus, another name for Chafra, is also contained many relics, and Bodine also contained a vase with blood and a piece of cloth. So these are not pure containers for a single relic by any means, but not only do they contain multiple relics most frequently, but they represent a place in the hierarchy of the church rather than single persons through their iconography, but also through the relics that are put inside of them. But nonetheless, as we've been talking about these, I think we see that these head reliquaries of southern France very much stage the human presence of the saint. They're not portraits, but as I said before, they're in some sense a construction, a machine, constructed to carry forward the prayers of the faithful, working as part of a larger representational system. Now, if we go back to Bernard's first comments, I mentioned them before, but Bernard said that these figures arouse the devotee's effective piety. If a pilgrim or devotee asks properly, for example, in the miracles, there's a blind man who, quote, prostrated himself and prayed for a long time. Engrossed in prayer, he made all his needs known to the holy martyr. He or she, the process or the way that prayer is done is extremely important, and only if it's done properly would the saint grant the wish. The saint indeed has to not just immediately grant, but there's a kind of a sense of her working for the devotee. She starts a process. So the prayer is one part, and then in response, Foix starts a process. So, for example, in one part of the miracles, she speaks in the first person. I raised an immense outcry, and with it I swayed the goodness of the heavenly judge to mercy. I importuned God for your health, and with the diligent presence of my prayer, so long until he returned a favorable and sympathetic outcome to my pleas. So here in the first person, she's telling us about the process. And what does that tell us, really? Is she the source of the miracles? Foix? I importuned God for your health, and with the diligent presence of my prayer, so long until he returned a favorable and sympathetic outcome. Right, right. I hope you all understand the process of intercession, but we must take it really quite seriously. She's not the source of the miracles. We often make that mistake and imagine, oh, she's working miracles, but saints do not work miracles. They pray to God, and here's Bernard's making it really clear to us. They pray to God, and then God decides, and okay, well, you're praying so long, you're being so diligent, you're raising a clamor, therefore I will grant that miracle. So again, Bernard is very careful in these miracles to explain it all to us in one place or another. It's very discursive. It's not like he gives a lecture. He tells it through story, which is going to be the most effective way. So although these saints have a real personality and a presence, it's not they themselves that grant the cures and the miracles. It's their connection to God, their prayer before God, but also their connection in the community as martyrs and members of the court of heaven. So let's look at some more at Voix. Let's more dissection, more thinking about it. Here I've got some of the early black and white photographs that were from the Restoration, which was done by Jean Taralon, Taralon, if you don't know. And he discusses his what he found. And there we see a photograph of the eye. Because as you saw in that photograph I showed you a moment ago, the mask itself has no eyes attached. It may have originally had eyes, but when they reuse it for the statue, it doesn't have eyes. So they're constructed separately. I think it's very important to notice that all of the head reliquaries have eyes that are very compelling, and most are made out of a different material so that they're more contrasting, they're more visible, they're very exciting, they have a presence to them. And oftentimes the texts, which are very minimalist on these, medieval texts on these, do mention the eyes. So they were a striking part from the beginning. There you can see that her eyes are very bold, very striking from the high contrast point of view. And this photograph is taken, this has been Beata Frick's view of Sainte Foy, because she wants to emphasize that as you look up into her and it's not fully lit in that sort of brilliant lighting that most of the photographs are taken in, you see the eyes kind of, almost floating above in this gold field above you. And here's some more on doll and eyes. He says some interesting things about the eyes of the figure. He talks about how they have a characteristic of a cult image, a hieratic appearance, generally combined with a frontal pose, an erect head position, the eyes wide open and piercing, and the entire figure, where the covering has been preserved, sheathed in precious stones. It is and then down to the second quote, it is the eyes as the window of the soul, which more than any other organ reflect the inner life of the spirit. The eye of the saint is resplendent with grace and power. His glance has an inner fire, terrifying to the beholder, penetrating the secret recesses of the heart. The face of Stephen of Aubazine shone with an extraordinary grace, although he himself was a person of rough appearance. He shone with such an inner light that people could not take their eyes off him. Ordinarily meek and smiling, he was terrifying in anger, and this is a medieval text, did he fix the ray of his eyes on you, you felt entirely penetrated, so that the very secrets of the heart seem revealed. Nothing could escape his gaze. So there are these medieval texts that talk about the way these eyes work. Here in Stephen of Aubazine, that kind of thing of the eyes follow you around, or something to that effect. But really, one can imagine in the shrine, as you're in front of one of these almost very majestat, this very commanding presence. It's the eyes that really look into you, and as you offer your prayer, it's very easy to imagine that the saint is literally looking back at you. The Cistercian who of Bonneveau preached the word of faith with such spiritual fervor that a flame seemed to issue forth from his face and eyes. Now that's a living person, but still that kind of attribution to the eyes as being almost super animate, as having this kind of power. Of course, in the sense of medieval vision, one actually talks about rays issuing forth from the eye and returning, bouncing off the object, so to speak, and returning to the eye. So the medieval understanding of vision, which was a much more projective kind of a sense of that sense of the sense of sight. So this notion that the eyes can project flames or can look out at you and fix on you is very much a consonant with their sort of scientific understanding of what sight is, but also with the sort of the feeling that you have in front of these sculptures. Another one, the Venerable Carthusian Brother Einhard, his eyes glittering divinely, terrible to the unworthy, but to the good, most affable and mild. So it could even be, depending on the purity of your soul, you could have these glances and gazes could affect you differently. Those two last texts are really interesting because there's a very important movement in the 11th and 12th century of living figures of holy persons being something that you gaze upon and learn from. You model your body on the bodies of your teachers who are very holy persons. And they are to walk, you are learned to walk with decorum, to hold yourself upright, to look in certain ways. So you're always observing, and this is a monastic practice, you're always observing these people and trying to behave in some way like them with a proper spiritual decorum. And so their eyes being something that dart and flame and can penetrate and look upon you are really something very, very acute in this period. It's not as if you're just glancing at your friend or interacting in a casual way. This is a whole kind of contemplation of the body as a special kind of unit of meaning. So, again, we've picked her apart a little bit in terms of her meaning, in terms of her semiotic meaning or symbolic meaning, the bits and pieces having different functions but coming together to create this great agglomeration that she exists on. But let's now talk about her literally in terms of her construction. And of course we have to go back to Tarrelon and the actual moment when she was disassembled and they looked inside of her to see what she was really made of. So we begin, of course, again with the mask. And the mask is a really interesting question. What do we imagine this to be? How did this come here? What is this thing? We have no idea. There is no evidence for it. It just exists. But clearly, somehow the monastery acquired it. Maybe it was a gift right away, as a noble gift of some sort, or this mask had been preserved in some fashion from the Roman period. And maybe it seemed as if it was a worthy gift to give to a powerful saint. And do you remember back to the as the artist wished, when Bernard said that? That's sort of the whim of the artist. My thought is that this came as a gift, was probably given as a gift with a thought that would be melted down and turned into a reliquary. Maybe a little box or something to that effect. And as the artist wished, he suddenly thought, no, let's do something even more interesting here. Let's make, and she's really one of the earliest of these maestras, so let's go ahead and make this into the image of the saint. So it was that artist, that original artist, that was able to make the leap and say, this can represent Foix, this imposing face, and why not use it and leave it relatively unchanged? If we, yeah?
Just because I was always thinking about this process, because on one hand, why not? You imagine artisan,
Yeah.
who get his hand
Yeah.
on Toulouse, for example, his clothes from a city, it was possible to have it there, and then he decided to do sculpture, like accidentally, let's say. The right created it. And what about if the presence of this face was the first step in order to permit the creation of the entire sculpture?
Yeah, yeah.
In this case, what would be the reason why this kind of hand? And of course, we can be on the, let's say, general level, thinking about the Carolingian spoliatio, like identity element. So Charles takes from Rome Lupa, he takes other pieces from Ravenna.
So I'm getting the sense that you're saying there might be an imperial notation here, that they're willing and eager to go ahead and adopt an imperial sense for foi. Yeah, yeah.
Christian emperor,
Okay.
one of them.
Uh-huh.
Then suddenly the vision of the face of the emperor can be the first step in order to create
Mhm.
really the object,
Right.
which suddenly can be.
Right, but I would counter that just slightly in the sense that I don't think they were, it's just not a situation I can imagine that they would be able to go out and find this head. You know, they would say ahead of time, I want an imperial image, let me go find it. I think it was complete happenstance that it was available. Do you see what I mean? I mean, there were not enough of these heads knocking about. A few still exist, but they're really very unusual. Most of them were melted down. That's a really big mass of gold. So just the fact that it survived, I don't think they were able to say, oh, I'll start with the head of an emperor. Where can I find one of those? That's not what really, I think it came to them as a gift, and then that process of justification and possibilities in the head presented itself. I think that's the scenario I imagine.
The accidental is not arriving is true. For me, just the idea is that they recognize it as an imperial.
Yeah.
And for that, because the other point is that the second sculpture, the region which you have, small Charles, is probably also
Right,
Constantine becoming Charles.
right.
So the process is quite
Mhm.
similar.
Right, but there they're actually trying to evoke an imperial, a whole imperial environment because Charles is the emperor. This is going in a different direction, so it's not exactly the same. But yeah, sure, it's very. Did you have a question?
No, I was just like thinking like if we should do like kind of writer or someone like that, or like another saying, or not like say but kind of the subject. And so they like wanted to use it for like the Christian or like if maybe like also with this process of finding the relics, like why people from home researching for relics or why they steal the sample, like
Maybe they stole the head.
maybe because they for some kind of against God, like not a Christian one, and
Uh-huh.
so kind of like put his power into the Christian one.
Like a conversion moment. Yeah, I mean, that's another good way to see it because it is a pagan image and they're converting it through their use. I think that's very important. Now, I mean, where this was and how they got a hold of it is a really interesting question, and we just really wish we knew more. But I don't know. I just find it a little unlikely that it was just lying about or easily available, that somehow it came through a noble gift, it seems to me. But you know, maybe it came from the court because there are Carolingian gifts that are made, not Charlemagne himself. We'll be talking about that tomorrow. But there are Carolingian family gifts that are made to this monastery, and maybe that was where it came from, and maybe it came from their cache of objects that they'd acquired. Yeah, maybe it came that way. But at any rate, it's not a fully imperial gesture. But there are lots of interesting things the way this becomes the core of the figure. So I think it's really good to think of it. But then this is the other core. Really, really clumsy. Isn't it really amazingly blunt? Just not what you think of as an artwork at all. Can you see it? Is it blackened out? It's kind of, but it's a very, very not what you might say finely carved piece of work. It is apparently yew wood. Y-E-W, yew wood, which is a hard wood to carve, apparently, also a good wood to resist rot. So it is still the original core from Foix, it's still in there. But still, even so, look at the size of those feet, look at the clumsiness of the legs. There is no sense of naturalism in this body at all. So when we see that presence of Foix and the sort of elegance that she conveys, it really is due to the head, isn't it? Because the body is not happening. And when you go back to that comment by Bernard, that she was a poor thing until she was renewed, you can understand that, yes, this example here, it really is, if that's just sheathed in gold, it's still not a very convincing figure or a very imposing figure. So she really demanded those adornments in order to look better. At any rate, yeah, I don't know how many of them you know. I should have brought it, there's a wonderful head reliquary in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that they have extracted the wooden core from. And that wooden core is carved beautifully. Absolutely. It's every bit as beautiful as the metal sheathing. So this is not a necessity or a norm even. Perhaps maybe because she's so early, this is what we have. But in a later moment, the interiors, the wooden cores were carved quite beautifully. Here's I think an interesting juxtaposition, and that is, what about the way she looks at us? Now, if we take the head, the core, the element, the Roman head, the pagan thing inside, we really need to think of it as properly set on the right-hand side. Do you see that? It's a realistic, a naturalist approach to the head, and as is proper, the neck angles back to join the body. Do you see that? But when we come to foie, actually, one of the key aspects of foie, that is her kind of aloofness, is actually based on the way the head is set on the body. Here's the wooden core again, and that's the neck. Again, a really blunt little thing there. Just the cylinder. Let's make it out of you. Let's stick it on top of this body, and then we're going to put the mask on top of that. Do you see? And that automatically means that the head is slanted back. If you go back to the ones we were looking at before, their faces don't do that. Their faces don't look up like foie. We can get all excited about her looking towards heaven. We can think about her being a woman and they're not looking directly in the eye, but probably all of that is wrong. She simply looks up because this is how they attached the mask to the body. It does create still a very aloof, a kind of imperial figure, a kind of a regal figure, which people like and see as part of her personality, perhaps. But it really is, I think, a function of the way the mask was attached to this wooden core. There we see again from the front the wooden core, and again you can see how very unarticulated that interior wooden sculpture is. Not very subtle. Okay, as we move on, we start to see other bits of the reliquary that become very much part of her identity. The crown. What does that crown look like to you? Anything? Anybody know medieval crowns to any degree? No, you don't know medieval crowns, so that's okay. But you see it has a ring, and then it has two arches, crossing arches, and also fleur-de-lis, yeah, right. Yes, this is quite probably a Carolingian crown, an actual Carolingian crown. And this is what Tarrelon reconstructed it as originally, although that's somewhat contested. Her head is too small for a real crown, so they would have had to size it down. And in fact, if you imagine that this crown has two bands crossing one another, you can find many Carolingian manuscript depictions and so forth of crowns that look like that. So that's a Carolingian type of a crown. It is interesting to imagine that the fleur-de-lis were positioned differently. You can see that they're at the edges of the band, and they stand proud of the bands so that they're more visible. Do you see that? And the way that they finally put it on foie, they sort of turn them in and turn it into a kind of a little dome over her head. So those are all modifications to what is clearly, again, a votive gift to foie. So a very important votive gift. In fact, head reliquaries very, very many times are given the gifts of royal crowns. One of the earliest documented head reliquary is given by King Bozon, and he gives his crown to the reliquary. We know that they're just drawings of this, but we know that there were, and then another crown was given to that same reliquary, so that it becomes a proper kind of a gift to a head reliquary to give a royal crown. Sometimes they become a kind of a hat rack for crowns while they're, between coronations and that sort of thing. So there's a kind of an affinity between these golden images of saints and the crowns of kings, a sort of a proper votive gift to such an object. There's one other really interesting Carolingian era gift on the sculpture, and did anyone see this morning? You did see it, good. It was remarkably dark in there. In fact, I wound up quickly taking a photograph, and all you could see was the serpent in the photograph. All you can see is a sort of a generalized oval, and then the serpent coiled beneath the cross, which is kind of dramatic. But that is very clearly a Carolingian rock crystal. The scholar Ginevra Kornbluth did a catalog of these and went into discussion of their making, and they are quintessentially Carolingian. Rock crystal is a very difficult and hard stone to carve. It takes special skills and techniques. It's only done in certain places and certain times in the Middle Ages. And the Carolingians mastered it in these examples. These are cabochon, that is half-rounded gems, smoothed and rounded on the top. And what they do is they carve, as you can see in this photograph, the backside of the crystal. And that allows it, someone was asking me about the magnification quality of these crystals. Yeah. And that magnifies the image, which is really wonderful, so that these seem to sort of grow inside their crystal capsules, so to speak. And they do it with a drill, and you can see a lot of little round sort of points on the crucifix there, and that's because those are individually drilled. It's a sort of meticulous technique of making these figures. So this is a very fine example of a Carolingian crystal. Clearly a very generous gift to Foix, probably also at least a noble and probably a royal or imperial gift. It's interesting to see consistently in reliquaries when a very large gem is given to a saint and put on his or her reliquary, there is an association with imperial, because these large gems belong to royalty, in effect. They are properly the possessions of royalty. There's a very strong association in the Middle Ages. The kings would have treasuries filled with large and very valuable gems, and other people simply really couldn't own them because they belonged to royalty in some sort of sense. So then when that gift is made, when it's given to a reliquary, it becomes a kind of a recognition of the power of the saint, because that's a royal gift. So we see both a crown and then this gem that really, and of course the throne and everything else, that really start to situate her in a very elevated status.
Can I ask?
Oh, there's another even better picture, yes?
It's originally there at this place, because it's interesting to me that it's on the back side, it's so precious, so I would
Yeah.
expect that from the...
Yeah, you would.
I really would, but
I-
if it was there, because the throne was, remade the other crystals, so if you know if it's original place of the crystal or not.
No, we do not know who gave the crystal. It would be very nice to know that. It is believed that this crystal was placed in that remaking that Bernard suggests. And actually, I should go back and let's talk a little bit about that remaking. This is the one I want? No. That one. Yeah. So if we're starting with an image like this with a head on top, maybe the crown is there, because the crown is often dated to, these dates are all a mess. But often the crown is said to be Carolingian, and that's assumed that it was immediately put on the figure, but maybe not. Oftentimes it's discussed as if the body is ornamented and remade in the 10th century, because Bernard seems to be aware of it as being recent. So we're putting it just before his era, perhaps. One of the interesting things is Beate Frick, who's written a book on Saint Foix, but it also goes into lots of other issues, so it's not exactly a monograph on Foix. But she's a major scholar to have worked on this, and she believes that, in fact, Foix was not a seated figure before this remaking, that there is a joint in the wooden core, and that she was a majesty like the other majesties we saw. So a half-length bust, and then the legs were added. I don't know that anybody else says that or agrees with her. I'm not sure I agree with her. I don't see a reason that Foix can't be kind of unique, why she had to follow with the men, why she can't be, in fact, more like a virgin figure, because there was one precedent for an image of the Virgin. It was very important in this area. It was from Clermont-Ferrand. That was a whole seated figure. So it's unclear exactly what status that had. But it's clear that in the remaking, this moment of remaking, probably the 10th century, that the throne was remade. So the throne is not thought to really be at all, there's one picture here. No, I don't have another picture of her on the throne, but so that one's on the throne. But so the throne gets constructed. Whether there was an earlier throne, probably there was, if she was a seated figure. Maybe it was just wood, maybe it was painted wood or something like that. But at any rate, they remake the throne in this period. So that's when they put the gem on. So maybe that seemed fitting to put it on the back. Or maybe to give her a nice presentation from the rear as well. The other thing is each of these stones, as gifts, are going to be placed on the statue, and there's going to be some memory of where they came from. It didn't extend to us, but at that time, people would know who'd given each stone. And they weren't going to move them around, probably, because, like, you're going to move my stone from the front to the back? So, what?
On the other hand, if it's on the back,
Yeah.
it means that it's only possible to see it if you have access to the back.
Well, whenever she was in procession, you would see it. And she was processed a lot. Yes, that's true. I agree. Yes. But how much could you see of any of these gems? I think that the average viewer couldn't see any of the gems individually. Yeah. Well, it's big enough that it might have caught the light. And there was a sort of a, remember yesterday I mentioned the mythical stone? And now I'm not thinking of it. What? What? Yeah, carbuncle, thank you. Yeah, the carbuncle, which is discussed in all these medieval texts, but basically it's a mythical stone because it's supposed to glow on its own. It's supposed to have an inner light that can glow on its own. And there, insofar as they ever believed they had one in the Middle Ages, it seems to have been the rock crystals. Now, the problem with that is carbuncles are supposed to glow and they're red, and rock crystals are clear and white. But I've seen a lot of it. I'm really interested in this question. I don't know how to resolve it, but I've seen a lot of rock crystals with red behind them, behind the rock crystal itself. So I wonder whether they're trying to evoke the sense of a carbuncle with that maneuver. I don't know. But at any rate, they really talk a lot about gems kind of glowing on their own. So this large rock crystal put on the back, maybe it was felt, maybe they thought they could see it, even if they really couldn't, or I don't know. I don't know, it is a good question, because why take this most gorgeous piece and put it in a place that you can't see it?
It's actually more visible because when you stand in front of her, you have tendency to look her in the eye.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it's more visible behind where it's like dominant feature.
It is a representation of the crucifix, too, so maybe it sort of backs up or supports her in some way symbolically. Yes? Oh, yeah? Uh-huh. It might, yeah. Yeah, well, we'll have to take our cell phone flashlights and play around with it. No. I know, you're going to take it out and use candles, I know, but I'm not going to be here, so I don't want to hear about it.
One is the invisibility is not a problem at all. I mean, the fact that you don't see it, but you know that there is something behind it is already good. I mean, it's the discussion about the private color and
or with a very limited audience.
Yeah.
Very, very limited.
And sometimes you cannot. If it's too high, for example, you can just not see it at all. And the second aspect is the question of the procession, because I don't know if you have seen the photographs of the actual processions, which are happening like each 8 and 9 October. And what's interesting is not so high. They are just two bands, how they get. But since we are in Conques, the crowd is all around, even on the top of the hill and everywhere. What I want just to say that if it's well illuminated, you can still see the small cross from a certain distance because of the light gain. If you have a crowd of person all around, I mean, the small cross will be, of course, not in details, but you will probably get the possibility to see it, especially with sun, because the crystal rock becomes just a dream when the sun is touching it. And so if you imagine really people walking all around the church, the crowd up and down to the hill, and the procession of two men holding it was small, it's not a big. Then suddenly you can imagine the visit.
Oh, I have some pictures of the procession. We'll get there. Right, and yeah, and it's really interesting. When I take my students into the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Griffith Mann often shows us a reliquary that has a large crystal. It's a bigger one than this one, about this big. And he takes a flashlight and puts it on it, and it does just kind of light up. It's really quite remarkable. This is not in a position to do that, nor is it quite as large, but nonetheless, I think it can catch light in a way that is unexpected. So, as you say, let's play around with some flashlights in the treasury the next time we go, because I think that it has more potential than one imagines. When you take a photograph, you have to kind of flatten it out in order to get the details. And that's both is nice for us, because we want to see the details of the crucifix, the crucifixion image, but it's really not representing what it might have looked like in the Middle Ages. So this was the next picture of thinking about how she's made. So we have had the mask, the wooden core, the crown, the gems, one gem in particular, but then also her sheathing. And she was really, as we said, covered with gold. There's really massive amounts of gold on her, so she was just a really, really rich object from the beginning. But that doesn't seem to have stopped them from putting yet more gold onto her through centuries of veneration, so that for some reason they took down the antependium that they had in the church. Maybe the church was under more threat. It wasn't safe to have a big gold antependium on their altar. Maybe they needed other parts of that gold to pay off bills or something, but they kept that one central element, the Christ in Majesty that you see there, and it was actually placed on her. So it was recovered from her, and I didn't see it this morning. Did anybody? Yeah? Yeah, okay, well, I didn't see everything because I was focused on, that piece of wax really got me. But yeah, so we looked to see that, because that was attached to her, and it's her before the most recent restoration, but represents other parts of gold that existed. Here's a few more of the gems in close-up in very good photographs, so you can really see them. And one of the other aspects that's quite interesting is that they're not plain gems, right? We talked about this a little bit yesterday. They're not plain cabochon gems. They're not polished. They are seals. They are engraved. They are antique, some of them, or they are seals that were used to make impressions. All the ones you can see in that picture just about are engraved gems. Some of them of ancient gods and goddesses and figures of mythology and so forth. And once again, we have to talk about a conversion from the pagan to the Christian by reuse in this kind of use of spolia. It was not troubling, apparently, at all to medieval viewers. They were aware that these things represented non-Christian subjects in many cases. Other times, it's a little confusing. But what was important probably was their great antiquity, that is in service of foi, and their gift potential, that they are gifts from nobility and from sources that are passed down through noble hands or royal hands or imperial hands to Foix. So they're a record and testimony to her great value.
Also, in Italy, we have those testimonies of family, patrician family, who pursue through all the early Middle Ages. So we can really imagine families from Toulouse having the familial rings in front of them, in one line, patrician family.
Right.
So the gift is like the heritage of the family. So it
Yeah.
makes the gift even more splendid. And you use the gem, which was the sign of the memory of the family. It's something which gave more power to Saint-Foix. Because everybody was probably able to recognize, if he able to see it, that it's an antique trace of this prestige going from Roman antiquity until 9th century.
And right, and they probably remembered which family it was from. So, which was really wonderful. Unfortunately, that's speculation to some degree on our part because we don't have those documents. But I think it's really legitimate to see it that way because as we just said a moment ago, these gems belonged in the noble families. They did not, you don't imagine they just sort of turned up or somebody had them hidden in their attic. They're very much treasured possessions that were passed down through very noble, very high level families. So, in talking about this sort of assemblage of images, this sort of accumulation on her body, I just thought we'd select out one miracle and read it through to think about how she acquired all this stuff and, how this go on. Okay. So in the Liber Miraculorum, we read this. But even long before these events, yet in our own time, there occurred a most felicitous miracle concerning golden doves. If there is a time for hearing, and if you kindly people will admit a true story into the secret places of your heart, don't you love the way they set this up? It's why it's good to read a whole one occasionally instead of just quote them, because you really get the feeling for like, okay, now I'm going to give you a lesson. Each of these miracles is I want to say that about a hagiographic text, about a saint text. They're all very carefully chosen. This is not a random assortment. These are miracles that are chosen to be written down in order to emphasize certain things. In Foix's case, that she cures blindness, that she has a certain relationship to her community, and so forth and so on. Or they might be a miracle that teaches a lesson of some sort. So read them in that light. So let it enter the secret places of your heart. Then I shall immediately tell you of a miracle about the fashioning of the famous image, which is called by the inhabitants of the place the Majesty of Saint-Foix. So there she is. This is where it's referred to as a majesty. It is made of the finest gold, and through portions of the garments, as the judgment of the craftsman demanded. Again, we get the craftsman making decisions. Well, it's like so remarkable. It is becomingly adorned with gems, delicately and carefully inserted. The band about the head of the statue displays gems and gold, golden bracelets on golden arms, a low golden stool under golden feet, such a throne that there is nothing in it that other than precious stones, nothing except the best gold is visible. And also above the tops of the supports that project upward at the front, 2 doves made of gems and gold are seen to adorn the beauty of the whole throne, and about them it is now necessary to relate a miraculous event. When Bernardus, then abbot of Beaulieu and afterwards bishop of Cahors, owned the doves, he was admonished in dreams by Saint Faith, by Foix, that he should give them to her. Since he had refused to do this, he was prevailed upon again and again in the same way. So we have this poor bishop sleeping, and Foix appears to him and says, give me your doves. I want your doves. And he says, it's just a dream. I can ignore it, whatever. But no, he doesn't do it, and she appears again and again in his dreams, like, listen to me. And anyway, since he had refused, he was prevailed on again and again in the same way in the dreams. Finally, feeling that the warning came from God, he took other gold of the same weight with him and set out for Conques. There he offered this gold to God and to his saint and returned, certain that Saint Faith was pleased because of the equality of the weight. So, he figures, well, I have my doves. I like my doves. I'm just going to give her the equal in weight. That sounds like a perfectly good votive maneuver. No, not for Foix. But in fact, when once more he was sleeping one night, the same vision appeared, no less insistent that the doves be given to her, declaring that he would not be able to make satisfaction in any way, even if he paid out all of his gold, unless he would give her the doves as well. Finally, the reluctant man was compelled to deliver the golden doves, just as though they had only been entrusted to him for safekeeping. And he placed their remarkable beauty on the supports of Saint Faith's throne. Now, as we might remark, they are no longer there. So that's, again, it's both evidence of how her bits and pieces were acquired, but also evidence for how much has changed. So there was constant revision going on. At some point, those were moved. These rock crystal balls that are on the throne are much later than the High Middle Ages. They're a later addition. So one shouldn't imagine, perhaps the doves were there. Maybe that's where the doves were at that time. I don't know. It's not clear that for the front supports what exactly that means. And then this is another from Dahl about the gifts of jewelry. She actively promotes by all possible means, indeed even a kind of spiritual vendetta. It's funny, she's almost seen as an aggressive saint in terms of demanding this jewelry, appearing over and over again in dreams, or even being kind of nasty in order to get what she wants. Or the other thing that the people of Sainte-Foy are so fond of her, they call her a trickster saint. She plays little jokes on the people, yoka and Occitan, I think it is, that her little miracles are sort of like clever and trick people into making these gifts. So there's all kinds of means that she does. She uses visions and she punishes if you hesitate. She collects gold and stones. She forces a noble lady to give up her ring, visiting again in her sleep, and later inflicting a fever on her. So the bishop just got lots of apparitions, but this woman gets a fever because she hasn't gone ahead and given up her ring. She's tough with this Foy. There's the golden sleeves from the Countess of Toulouse, who gives her instead a ring. Again, you can't get away with that. But she also gets there's an exchange here of she conceives a male heir. The woman is able to get pregnant because she makes the gift. So there's a back and forth. It's not just that Foy demands that you give it just because you respect Foy. Sometimes you get something in return. An expectant mother is relieved of her pains. Countess Riccarede capriciously claims the delightful filigree, she claims the delightful filigree brooch, the sort of thing that takes the fancy of young girls. Again, they do conceive her of her as a young girl sometimes. When this countess refused to give her the brooch, she winds up losing it. And then they find it on the statue. So she somehow miraculously transported it from the countess's possession to her own. So there's all kinds of ways that she works out this sense of her giving the gift. There we go. There she is in procession. That's possibly not the very best picture of her. And in fact, here's another one with everybody standing up, as you said, a little higher level as they're looking out. And do you see that in the hands? Do you see what they use the hands for? They have little tiny tubes, and they put apparently flowers in them. I don't know when that dates to, but apparently that's what they do today in the feast, which is really quite fascinating. So, and here's one more picture of a procession. See, now I think this is the staging of the procession before it gets going. So, she's even got a little canopy on top of her. I mean, I know she travels about in this plexiglass box, but here they even give her a little sort of Pope-mobile thing here. At any rate, and that's interesting to see the local clergy, including a Greek Orthodox, come to participate in the. Let me see if I can get back to an overall picture of her. There, let's stop with that one. So, we talked last time about votives and the shrine complex, but I think that as we look at the figure of Foy, we can clearly see that she is, in some sense, a representative of the treasury itself. I want to read you one other miracle, which I find quite remarkable in terms of this sort of notion that things belong to her. and partly about the remaking of the statue, this moment when it gets adorned. I won't be slow to tell you what happened to a young man named Gerbert, because he became an employee of the monastery. When Gerbert was strolling one day in front of the smithy where the golden altar frontal had been made, so that's that large golden altar frontal which later came to be attached in part, he happened to discover among the ashes discarded from the furnace the earthenware vessel in which the craftsman had melted the gold. And that vessel had been softened by the intense heat required to liquefy the gold, and a swollen hollow space had formed in its very bottom. Particles of the metal had run down into the space and lay hidden there. And so when Gerbert caught sight of a tiny gleam shot forth by the hidden gold, and which had been somewhat uncovered already and was sparkling brightly, he came closer. He decided to see what it was, and after he broke the vessel, he found in the little hollow a ball of purest gold, 9 deniers and 1 obol in weight. Oh, we know exactly how much it weighed. By the impartial scale. Gerbert rejoiced greatly over his find, as a person would who had never owned any gold. He thought he should hide it with a friend of his. Some days later, Gerbert was lying down in bed, for one of his eyes had developed a rather serious inflammation. It seemed to him that Sainte Foy appeared to him in a vision, not in the form of a girl, but contrary to her usual custom, in the form of her sacred image. I think this is one of the most remarkable mentions, because all of the other ones seem to talk about her glowing face and her radiation, her radiant attire and her halos, her glow and so forth. But here in this particular one, she actually appears, and it's said as her sacred image, not as her usual custom. And she severely demanded of the gold that Gerbert had hidden away. So no secret anymore. Gerbert was found out by Foy. Then she seemed to leave as if she were angry. On the next night, she seemed to appear again in the same terrifying way, and to leave as threateningly as before. This time Gerbert made her a solemn promise he would return the gold the next day, when he nonetheless persisted in his hard-headed stubbornness. The same vision, but far more terrifying, came to threaten the naysayer on a third night. She said, "Tell me, you worst of criminals, why haven't you returned my gold to me when I've demanded it back so many times?" Together with this verbal reproof, she thrust toward his sore eye a hazel wand that she seemed to carry in her right hand, as if she were about to strike him. Gerbert turned his head away in another direction, as if to avoid a very swift blow, and in a higher voice than he was usually able to speak, he cried out, asking for mercy over and over again. And as the greedy man had been struck down by great fear, that he carried the gold back to God and Sainte Foy the next day, and that after that he told himself he suffered no injurious punishment. And then he worked for Sainte Foy thereafter. So this is a really interesting miracle, both because she's known for curing. There's a great number of miracles in here that are not involving gold, so we haven't talked about them, where she heals blindness. She heals a blind man who becomes her servant, and he has lots of other things happen to him as well. So blindness is her specialty. And here she sort of does an inverse thing on him. She punishes him with an eye ailment in order to say, you better give me your gold. So it's the reverse of her normal activity. But also that this is a very frightening, the image itself, the shrine image is frightening rather than a little girl or pretty or radiant. It's a scary thing. And the third thing I want to really emphasize about that is the gold belongs to her. Whether it was found by him and it had been thrown away on a trash heap as a used ceramic vessel was no good anymore, doesn't matter. He found the gold belonged to her, he had to return it to her, which I think is a really fascinating thing about the way that she attracts these different votive things. They in a sense belong to her from the beginning, and she's just sort of like a big magnet drawing them to her, and they get attached to her. So she becomes this great assemblage of all of the worth of the region, even. And again, I quoted yesterday Pierre-André Segal, who argues that Foy's killing, blinding, or maiming of individuals who attacked her statue, her monastery, or her properties served as a deterrent to would-be aggressors, and made it quite clear, as again, that these things belonged to her, that they were rightfully her possessions. from one of the poorer ornaments, as Bernard talked about her earlier on, she's brought to a level of completion through the addition of gems, armbands, borders, and other embellishments as a very, very lavish and fascinating object that now dazzles the eye. When we see the processions of foi that we looked at earlier, and again here, we know that, in fact, the miracles record an extreme number of these processions. They were occurring all the time. One asks whether you can see the figure of foi. She was perhaps on an altar. It's not entirely clear where she was kept. There's some references to her being visible on an altar, but whether she was always there is a question. It was not customary to display reliquaries on altars until the later Middle Ages. It's very much an iffy thing in the Carolingian period. In fact, some clerics condemn it at that period. Only in the 10th century and later does it at all become more accepted, and usually it's in terms of festivals or particular moments rather than continuous display. So we very much are not clear about whether she was on continuous display, but it is mentioned that there was a grill in front of her even when she was displayed on the altar so that she couldn't be stolen, all that gold. But one time when people could see her was during processions. A number of the processions are recorded in the miracles, so we know that it was quite frequent. And another piece of evidence that tells us how frequently she was taken out is that the monks of Caen actually applied for permission to refuse to take out foi. The notion was that when it was bidden, if there was an illness or a plague or a threat of a property, some kind of judicial dispute, that foi was the ultimate arbiter. She was the one that should be referred to, and the request would be made to the monks. Bring her out, bring her here. We will have, a trial of some sort in the open during the procession, and so forth. And they just said, too much, too much. Everybody's asking for her. Can we turn them down? And they did get ecclesiastical permission to not have so many processions. So when we say, can you see foi? Yes, it does seem to be the case that you could. I want to read you another a description of a procession, not from foi herself, but from another source. Processions are perhaps the most active use of reliquaries, and they found a wide range of realization. They could be liturgical and common. Say, Cuthbert says at 9 o'clock, we went in procession with the relics as the custom of the day required. So that's an English source, and it's earlier, but the notion that you might just, at a certain moment during every day, pick up the relics and process through the church. Or processions could be very extraordinary and sort of on that particular day called upon, like the monks were being called upon, to bring foi out and respond to a request, or a famine or a drought. Conques was often carried into the fields to assert ownership of the land. The movements of a bishop might occasion the movement of relics. He might wear relics on his person, not foi, obviously, but smaller relics. And we know that they were carried customarily by bishops so that they often do cures when they're out moving through the countryside. But what probably is the most interesting in terms of foi are the dramatic processions that have this dramatic focus of this wonderful majestas figure. So what I want to read to you is a description of the Palm Sunday procession at Cluny in about 1023 to 35, which culminated with an appearance of the silver majesty of Peter. Now, we no longer have this object, but we know it existed at Cluny, a majesty, as it's described, of St. Peter. So one would think of it as looking something like the Bodim that we saw earlier. And this is in a condensation of the Latin text by Eileen Forsyth. And she writes, following the distribution of palm fronds, servants went forth carrying banners, and then came carefully vested lay monks with gold crosses and a crucifix, gold thuribles, holy water, candlesticks, and reliquaries. So we have censing monks, we have people carrying candles, we have the large crucifix, which we saw in the treasury, although that's a later crucifix, but still is a very important part of processions. And then reliquaries. So although the processions that we see in modern pictures include the crucifix, you can see that there at the front, and foi, it tends to be that's all we see in these processions that celebrate foi herself. That's probably not accurate to a medieval representation, because medieval processions almost always had many reliquaries in the procession. Foi by herself doesn't show her true glory. Foi draws things along like a magnet, including the other reliquaries in her treasury. So undoubtedly, some of the other reliquaries would have been processed along with her. 16 more lay monks bore the great statue of St. Peter and chests of relics in this procession at Cluny. So some individual relics, and then some chests of relics, accumulated smaller relics probably, moving. And then there were children, more monks, the abbot, and a large number of laymen made up the rest of the procession. As the bells were rung, they proceeded through the town to St. Myolis, and then back through the Galilee to the Abbey Church itself and into the church. Again, one sees a huge accumulation, not only of all the local clerics, all the monks, visiting clerics like we see here. Visiting clerics would take place in really big processions. All the people and the children would take part in the procession. We go out, we circle around. You don't just, make a linear procession. It tends to be exiting, climbing, going up, coming down, in the case of Conques, because we're on a hill, coming down that road we've all just walked on too as well. And then ceremoniously entering the big doors. That would be the moment, you should also imagine that, when the doors were fully opened. Have you ever even seen that? It happens on great feast days, but usually as a tourist you don't see that. They open up all those big doors, not just the little insert door, but the big door. And then, so that's a moment when you get to enter the church. Did they do that here? No. Yeah, the big door is open, not the little door. But maybe they would have opened both doors even, so that it becomes a great ceremonial entry. And they go into the Galilee and then into the church itself. So there's a real sense of importance. They're also usually carried, now today she's in plexiglass, but undoubtedly she was open to the air originally, although she was probably carried on a more ornate litter. And many of these are preserved in churches today. If you go off into the corners or into the side areas of the church, you'll see this strange golden thing sitting there, and it's often the litter for the reliquary procession that they are still using. It may not be really old, maybe 17th century or something, but it's usually gilded or very, very elaborate. So you have to imagine something like that for her, although they may have also carried a kind of a little tent over her head, which would have been supported on 4 poles maybe. So really quite more elaborate than this. One of the things that you should also, I'm going to talk about this more as we go forward, but today Conques only has 270 inhabitants, I think is the number that I read. And even in some low points when censuses were being made, they talked about Conques falling on hard times. In the 17th century, there were only 1,000 residents. Only 1,000 residents. So at its height, I don't know what the number was, but it was surely more than that. So it was a much more, it's not such a modest affair, is what I'm saying. The processions, if all the populace, a certain number of the populace gets to join in and then other people are watching, it's really, really a large thing, and it's an extended procession, more so than we have today. They would have banners, they would be singing. The text I just read mentioned bells, but there are other musical instruments that are used in processions. One of my favorite is some processions mention blowing olifants. And those have a really peculiar sound to them. I've heard the recording of them, and they're very deep and sonorous and strange sounding. So you take your olifants out of your treasury. Many treasuries did have elephants, and blow those. So one notes here that the central and compelling reliquary, that is something about like Foix, is supported by the cast of thousands. You know, really that's what we have here. It's not just a single reliquary, but many, many other relics and reliquaries. They're an essential part of civic identity, and you can see them today, of course, in many European towns, but especially in Conques, which is still very much the identity of the town of Conques is centered on Foix. But we'll talk about how that's expanded by the other reliquaries tomorrow as we look into the other, her other bits, and, you know, the other things she owned in terms of the other reliquaries of the treasury as we investigate them individually. So if we get to go back to the treasury before I talk tomorrow,
Yeah,
you are going to go?
yeah. We now negotiated this way of doing that we can go each day.
As a group or individually, or?
Individually as we want.
Oh, as whatever you want. So if you have a chance to go back to the reliquary, next time we're going to talk about the Pippin reliquary, the lantern, and the reliquary of Pope Pascal II. Now, I think that as we've looked at Foix, we've seen how much she's an effort of accumulation and aggregate. She's like added to, and it's very visible on her. But with the other reliquaries, I think you also see that not only do they have additions, but they've very obviously been repaired. So I want you to try and look at them very carefully and see where the repairs occur as much as you can. Try and understand how they've been put together, because that's what we'll be talking about in part tomorrow, and it'll help if you've already observed that. And it takes very careful looking, because for one thing, it's too dark in that treasury, but also because they've tried to cover it up. Although some of it's quite clumsy too, so you'll be able to see it easily. But so have a look to that, and look from one reliquary to another and see if you can see strata. That is, bits that correspond from one reliquary to another, even though they might be from different eras. Because that's something that happens in the group, because they were repaired as a group, I think. Made as a group, repaired as a group. The ones I'm looking at next time are made by the abbot Bégon, and so they're a certain era, but then they get changed again in another era. So that'll be really interesting, I think, for you to observe. All right. Are there any more questions? Let's talk about Foix some more if we want. And do we want to have some? Uh-huh.
Question concerning the number of processions of Paul is the practical, let's say, use as mediator between different groups, conflicts, and so on. Because for me, what's interesting is the aspect of mediation. Because I can well imagine that you have a conflict between two persons or a possession of a piece of land, you bring the reliquary and the solution arrives. There must be a person who is being the mediator between the object
Oh yeah,
and the
for sure.
person.